Dr. Bruce Sherrick has watched farmland values for nearly 4 decades now. And because of that, he knows that values are not collapsing, even though there have been some who feared that they would. Hi, I'm Dave Price, and this is the American Farmland Owner Podcast. Dr. Sherrick started at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign right before the 1980s ended. He's still there. He's a professor of land economics, and he's also the director of the TIAA Center for Farmland Research. He is a key contributor to the annual People's Company National Land Values Report, and that report has shown a dip in value in places. We're going to begin our conversation with how he sees the farmland landscape beginning in 2025. Let's start with, where do things stand now? Because as you've laid out, 2 years ago you had kind of a big factor. A year ago you had a big factor. This year you have a different factor. And I believe they all start with an I, if I remember right.
They do indeed.
How do you dig into this? What's going on?
So historically, we've always said that the factors that affect farmland or any other real asset can be kind of summarized in income, inflation, and interest rates. And because we've come through two periods of time where the federal government has managed interest rates very actively, it was pretty easy to identify kind of the causes and effects around that. And incomes are this year's feature, and the previous was inflation leading into this one. So yeah, they all begin with I. But the complexity or the increased uncertainty, if I had to, force another I into that conversation, everything is sort of spread out as well. Our information sets have gotten different. The ability to identify kind of forward expectations about income has gotten more complicated. But yeah, I think the story this year is really, what do people think the future is going to hold in terms of a longer term projection around income?
But what do they say? To put some lipstick on a pig here, or maybe to focus on the glass half full instead of half empty. You have values going down in places, but perhaps not as much as some people would have feared. Why is that?
That's a great question and a long-standing observation as well, that farmland markets don't tend to react as quickly as, say, the received wisdom models you would apply to, say, equities or traded stocks or even to fixed income. And partly because it's a much longer duration hold and it's a forward-looking asset. So that there's no simple way of saying, for a 5% change in this year's income, what would you expect the impact to be long term on the value? It's just, those linkages don't work quite the same way. Some other things, given that it's an annual production cycle, you can't really look at something like a quarterly income statement or a quarterly, return to equity or something like that, a shareholder report. And people also confuse, just to dig into, and we might as well clean the teeth on that pig while we're putting lipstick on it. This idea that somehow the prices of commodities, and when they're lower, incomes are lower, clearly, and when they're higher, incomes are higher, clearly, but not by as much as people often believe, because prices tend to be low when production is high, and prices tend to be high when production is low. There's a bit of a natural offset. So looking at long-term income looks at things like the expected demand for ethanol, the expected demand for exports, the expected demand for new uses, perhaps, of either the land underneath the production of the agricultural outputs or the outputs themselves. And so these are more complicated things, and we're affected by a war in Ukraine, and that impacted the wheat market, and it's gone on longer than we expected. We're impacted by South America systems and tariffs and exports and shipping lanes that take years to readjust. So I think one of the things to remember is that this is a really, really slow moving pendulum. To comment a little bit more, not directly ask, but on the way up, prices between, say, low quality and high quality land spread out quite a bit. And so again, if it's visually available, you can see that on the way up, kind of the classes of land spread out in value, and on the way down, they're kind of converging again. So the top end has definitely pulled back. The bottom part of the land market hasn't retreated nearly as much in most places. And again, I'm kind of anticipating questions in my rambling answer
Yeah.
here, but we have very thin markets as well. And so if only 1.5 to 2% turns over per year,
Yeah.
you may not be as sensitive to current price, and you may have a reason to kind of prop up prices on the way down more than would be the case in an unlimited full liquidity market like General Motors stock. I think those are important things to appreciate, but the additional uncertainty around Farm Bill and the additional uncertainty around our relationship with China and the changing administration and uh, things that impact the demand side long term, I think are have been spread out a bit.
Okay, talk about a bunch of things to dig into there, but why is it in your mind when you're talking about the lower quality land not falling as much as the highest quality? Why is that?
There's multiple explanations. All of them are somewhat um, almost overfitted. You know, we look backwards often and say, "Oh, that
Hmm.
must have been the explanation." I think one of them is that the highest priced land happened because it was opportunistically brought to market. And so when we kind of came through a period of fairly high commodity prices after a period of very high transfer payments to farmers, frankly, from MFP and COVID payments, market facilitation payments to make up for loss of exports, COVID payments to make up for whatever we were making up for. Um, and high incomes from a couple of years of better than typical production, while the
Hmm.
world grain stocks were somewhat lower. 2019, the upper Midwest floods helped clean out the excess soybeans, for example. So we got to that period, and farms that had been like maybe worth thinking about bringing to market. Okay, but the neighbor just sold theirs for 18, and there's an offer in place to buy stuff for 19,000 an acre. You kind of got this induced market of sales. And right now, those aren't the opportunities. So it looks like the high end's come off further than it has. If you were
Yeah.
to do, rather than the extreme sales, look at the medians instead, they moved in a much more consistent fashion that I think would follow our expectations around, um, cap rates and cost of capital. The other thing that's important to recognize is when interest rates were essentially zero, debt made sense, and when interest rates are 5 or 6%, debt makes a little bit less sense.
Sure.
So I'm being a little unserious about that point, except to say that neighbors with cash are different than an institutional buyer who's using leverage. So when neighbors had fairly deep pockets, you got that extreme run up in values. And then the question about why the expansion by asset class. Historically, I think the understood wisdom was that highest quality land will always continue to be the most productive and always have the greatest increase in value from productivity gains. Having a 3% productivity increase every year is like getting 3% more land and having the
Hmm.
same productivity. Um, I think we've caught up a little bit on lower quality agronomics, lower quality land agronomics and genetics and management. That's again maybe an ex post overfitted explanation, but the rate of return calculation for an investor, once you got the high ones bid up so high, became the case that the lower quality land may have had a slightly higher actual rate of return. So I need to buy the farm that borders me because I can't put my tractors on a truck
Hmm.
is a motivation to overpay for your neighbor's farm, perhaps. But if you separate out carefully the economics, part of that overpayment was a dilution of your fixed costs. You could say the value of the land was 15 and I paid 3,000 more to not have to drive my combine further. So I think part of that is also just present in the scale of things we're looking at as they go up. If you were to increase everything by the same percentage and decrease everything by the same percentage, they at least look like they get closer together when they all get closer to zero and expand further away when they get, closer to big numbers.
So the neighbor is often willing to pay more than an outside investor.
Of course.
Um, what ab- how do you look at I think the one thing that has been fascinating, we've been doing this podcast for a year plus, and so this has all been a fascinating journey for me to kind of dig into this and learn about this kind of stuff. And we talk so often on here about the available farmland acres essentially shrinking every year, right? And so that's always going to, it seems, always going to be a factor unless something dramatically changes in our country. What are we going to do? Start bulldozing houses and go the other way, and start planting stuff all over the place. So is that factor always going to be a positive force on values? Because aren't we just going to keep going in this direction as our population expands?
We are. There's some terminology here about, intensive margin and extensive margin, and whether or not you would bring things into production, and could you convert pasture land to row crop land if we got to that point.
Hmm.
But the order of magnitude question to start with is planting houses can be very, very profitable, right?
For
So
sure.
conversion and use quite often makes sense when the agricultural use might have been 15,000 an acre, but the residential use might be 50,000 an acre. It's hard to argue that the economics under the market don't make sense. Now, there are policy and social issues about land use and so on that we also consider. But yes, it will continue to be in effect. It's not as big of a percentage. I don't have the number directly. USDA keeps track of this pretty well, and we know, a couple million acres, 1.5 million acres, or some, we know about what's disappearing.
Hmm.
But we're also improving the productivity of what's left, and it's not the case that you randomly, knock blocks out of the pixel puzzle that is farmland. We don't, take one more acre out of the middle of Iowa and then one more acre out. We tend to expand around population centers that exist now. Better use of water, better genetics, better management of a lot of things in terms of growing degree day, capture, and the other things that compete against that are always like at that Malthusian contest. Are we going to eventually get to the point where we can't continue to expand for the population? And I think Malthus will always be wrong. This is a quote I've had forever. I think we can grow more. And on a world basis, people are often surprised to learn this. On a world basis, we are making more farmland. There's a great quote
Yeah.
from either Mark Twain or Will Rogers that says, buy land, they aren't making any more of it, something
Hmm.
like that. And in fact, we are. We can put more land, more arable land into production on a global basis. But that pushes to areas that probably aren't as productive. So if you replace an acre in west of the Chicago suburbs, you might need to put an acre and a half in somewhere in Brazil in order to compensate for the world production. So I think it does support US farmland. I think the convertibility of use. I think my joke is we've been 2 years away from large carbon payments for the last 15 years. Um, this converted use for things like renewables
Hmm.
and having land underneath solar panels and taking a little, chunks away for wind and so on,
Hmm.
also compete with production regions,
Sure.
but sometimes they're complementary as well.
Uh, that kind of leads me into, let's see how hard we can push you here, but the political dynamics. We have a change in a presidential administration. We have Elon Musk, whatever his influence is going to be in all of these decision makings, that's a whole fascinating dynamic to me, to have the ego, the personality of Elon Musk versus the ego, the personality of Donald Trump, and how do those two coexist, and who's driving the bus here?
Well,
Um,
I'll pay to sit in the background when you do that podcast with
Woo!
those two in the room. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. If we can sit those two down, that'd be a heck of a podcast. Let me work on that. But how do those dynamics go into the longer term play, even as we just look at farmland values, because you have so many uncertainties with Trump coming in, right?
Yeah, of course. And the short answer is clearly emphasis on greening the energy industry and on further development, experimentally in particular, of renewables is likely to be de-emphasized.
Hmm.
Is that good or bad? Nobody knows yet. And uh, the reality of the fraction of the market that's supplied by renewables is still very, very small. And when natural gas is cheaper than other mechanisms for renewable, it's hard to make arguments that the aggregate welfare should still favor one form of production over the other. So I think that's clear. And I think the historic efforts to use things like the Net Zero Project and prior to that, some other pathways toward energy zero in by 2050, or lots of versions of that.
Hmm.
I think we've clearly reduced relative to the previous experience the emphasis on that. I think all of that has a relatively small impact on land values in the short term, maybe in the long term. Solar is beginning to get to the point where it can almost stand on its own without a subsidy effect. If they're big enough fields, it's hard to make that argument if they're on small installations. It takes subsidy to put them on houses and so on. But
Hmm.
in large scale, they may, it's getting to that point where it's competitive with certain other production systems. But the big one in all of that and the administration change is the impact of tariffs. Um, you know, just no matter what anybody wants, there's a basic physics of the effects of markets when you have quantities and prices that are allowed to be determined. And tariffs don't work like a lot of people believe. Generally, welfare decreasing in aggregate. You can favor a protected industry if you wish by preventing another import. But I would point out that that's the greatest risk probably in the incoming administration, is if tariffs are at the level that have sometimes been bantied about as a promise or a political sledgehammer, because you don't recover quickly. We are not back to equilibrium in soybeans in particular from Trump 1.0 with China. And what followed, though, to put a more complete description on this, what followed those tariffs, though, were large market facilitation payments. So were farmers better off or not? Difficult to determine
Hmm.
based on who you were. If you were a livestock producer, probably worse off. If you're a soybean producer, not made terribly worse off. All those things have to
Hmm.
be like judged. But for the economy, they're a net negative in general. Um, and again, not to go too far down that rabbit hole as well, but in terms of the renewable, the de-emphasis from the incoming administration, that's seems like a clear direction. Um, some renewables might have to stand on their own sooner. You can
Hmm.
argue whether that's good or bad, and from a market perspective, um, our relationships with trade partners are important to recognize. Trade deficits are neither good nor bad. They're just a consequence of the relative costs of production in different locations. So we should want to import $400 75-inch TVs. We should want to export soybeans and corn, given our productive comparative advantages. Um, Creating everything in individually geopolitically constrained areas doesn't take advantage of those differences in resource and labor and other costs. And both economies suffer for that. So I think getting a more clear understanding of where we're going to end up is important before we say it's good or bad. And even then, there'll be distributional consequences. It'll be good for some industries, probably
Hmm.
not good for other industries. People focus a lot of their conjectures around what's it mean for Tesla or SpaceX or something, but there's a lot of
Yep.
other combined embedded economic interests in all of these conversations.
And as a reporter who has to cover Trump, and I've followed him in Iowa, one of the challenges is always trying to figure out what is a negotiating threat, if you
Mhm.
will, where he sort of negotiates in public. What is just kind of the bluster that is his persona that he wants to portray to make others fear him, respect him, whatever he's going for. As we talk, he has recently talked about the U.S. buying Greenland,
Mhm.
taking over the Panama Canal again, renaming the Gulf of Mexico, making Canada a state. I mean, there's a lot of that kind of stuff out there right now that the
Yeah.
national media will run after, and nobody knows what the hell any of this means, right? Like, is it legit? Is it just to push some conversation, all of that stuff? But if you're trying to make sense of all of this, you know, people have to plan their lives, so it's difficult to know.
So the income uncertainty for agriculture is increased for those reasons and many others, right? So we have, I think you're on a point to, the only thing I feel like I know a little bit about is still farmland values, though, and a lot of those may be exactly as you said, test balloons to find out what people care about, or to find out it's an efficient way to learn from your kids sometimes to threaten and find out whether the threat mattered or not. So I think the export disruptions are complicated to predict, and those matter a lot to agriculture and matter very, very directly. The demand side things that you impact are difficult to subsidize your way out of in the long term as well.
Hmm.
The other, I guess, area that the other areas in agriculture to, stay in this particular orbit a little bit, concern around labor and in dairies in particular, a reasonable fraction of labor might be difficult to find documentation to justify.
Hmm.
Likewise, in construction trades, a
Hmm.
lot of hand-picked orchard crops may have migrant labor that would feel particularly at risk for some of the um, deportation claims.
For sure.
Those are issues that will affect agriculture, and I think they become part of the structure that moves toward the eventual system. Would that promote more robots? Well, not in the near term. Would that promote more greenhouse? Not in the near term. Those like tests of those strength of those things, I would say I'm pretty confident that consumers are the loudest complainers when the prices of things change. And so claims tend to get finally adjudicated by pocketbooks in the end. And that's where I worry most about agriculture. If you were to, for example, have somebody involved in the healthcare industry that said no more pesticides, for example,
Hmm.
you just literally starve people. You can't do that. You can't make those transitions, and they're some things are known, some things aren't known, and we shouldn't you know relitigate some of the knowns perhaps, but the big impacts on agriculture from changing regulation around pesticide use and effluent and um, issues that may feel a little more distant are also really critical to get right, in addition to labor.
The labor is fascinating to me about as we wait to see will he go through with these mass portations and how far does he go, right? Because it doesn't seem practical
Yeah,
that if you want to go by the letter of the law and for anybody in this country without legal status that they're immediately taken out in whatever form this is going to be, we are going to have gaping holes in our labor forecast that it would seem would bring parts of agriculture almost to a standstill or incredibly weaken them short term, right?
agriculture has a much bigger exposure to wage inflation in certain parts, less so in row crop. But wage inflation is the thing you would expect to result from that. And again, there are processes in place. You can't. A couple of comments just to um, clarify. You can't take somebody out of a jail who's a foreign national and send them to another country without an agreement of the other country to receive them in some status, right? So it's complicated.
Sure.
And there are court proceedings that are necessary to move things. And people forget that immigration has been essentially trending up. So, it's higher under Obama than in prior presidencies, and higher under Trump one, and then higher under Biden, and it was creeping up. It's not a pattern that somehow was completely zeros and ones of things. And the highest rate of deportation happened during the Obama administration,
Hmm.
just because, but they're small numbers. So the highest rate doesn't mean anything either. So I think, you take an issue that a lot of people care about, you talk about it in fairly non-specific terms, and then it's easy to prospect into what are those big impacts that could occur from it.
Hmm.
And I think in agriculture, livestock and dairy in particular, and in housing, construction trades in particular, are the places you would expect to see those effects absolutely first. So,
If we can circle back to land values, the one thing that I believe you have discussed as you look at these trends is that yes, short term we may see a further fall, not
mhm,
huge, but we may see a further fall. But the longer term, and even using longer as maybe 4 or 5 years,
right.
you still can see a rebound and a change in that
I
trend.
do.
Is that right? And
Yeah, I
why?
still actually do. So we have the sequence, and it's been described as a sequence of increases and plateaus and increases and plateaus. And if you decompose the return to agriculture and farmland in particular as the major claimant, Ricardo got this right 220, 30 years ago. And it's fun before we turn the record on to talk about Adam Smith a little bit. This invisible hand is there whether we want it to be or not. And farmland is a non-depreciable asset. So you don't have to pay part of its asset value to keep it in place like you would with a office building. It also generates commodities, and the definition of inflation is the nominal change in value of a widely consumed, good or service or commodity. The expectation that farmland will remain nominally adjusting through time with inflation is a pretty strong tenet. It's difficult to find violations of that. What we do is we disturb its effort to stay on that trend with things like changes in interest rates. And to the extent those are market-based, we stick close. But when we, put $7 trillion on the Fed's balance sheet at a zero interest rate, you have cheap money, which inflates certain things. And you would expect it to inflate real values more than you would expect it to inflate other values. And it happened in farmland, almost anticipatorily even. So people will say, what do you think farmland values are going to do? And I'll say with 100% certainty, they're going to go up. But the other thing I'm careful is to, adhere to the economist creed. If you give a number, don't give a date. If you give a date, don't give a number. And if you happen to be right, don't look surprised. So I think this turnaround of the current, pullback has to be put in context. There are parts of the country that went up 30, 40, 50, even 60% over a year and a half period 2 years ago. And so to take a pause doesn't push the total return down very much at all. And as the stability of forecasts of income happen, almost jokingly in the report, we always look backwards a year before and say, what did we get right and what did we get wrong?
Yeah.
And, I almost tongue in cheek was very proud to predict that the yield curve would eventually normalize again. Not a real risky prediction as an economist, but we're starting to get there. And we're starting to get an upward sloping yield curve when that is less influenced by, hopefully, is less influenced by government monetary policy that's meant to reverse some other major event. If it's just meant to be market forces, that will become normal. Inflation had kind of, its episode of short-term inflation during the pandemic from food and some other things and energy, and then we had a longer term from housing, and then we have a sticky component from wages. Wages eventually will dilute themselves back to where they were in the economy. It's just how markets work. If we don't have any major interruptions, no pandemics, no giant wars, no massive changes in federal policy about things, in 4 or 5 years, I expect this to look like it usually looks, which is 4, 5, or 6% appreciation, 3 or 4% income, and I don't see anything that makes that not true. We're not going to fundamentally change the role of food in the economy. We're not going to change fundamentally where we produce food. I think controlled environment becomes more important through time, especially as water issues in Southern California change things like where we grow tomatoes, and leafy greens are easy to grow close to consumption. But corn, we're not going to grow in a greenhouse. Soybeans, we're not going to grow in a greenhouse. And if you back up and look at real data, we have the data, the major values of production, we know where they are, we know where they're produced. We can't really just start growing them on mountains, or, you're not changing where topsoil happens to be or where the water resources generally exist. So in 10 years, what's different? Well, technology. And we've been increasing productivity in agriculture at a mind-blowing rate. To be blunt, if you think of what let the world's population go from, depending on your beliefs, some small number, maybe 2, through 9 billion to eventually 10, wherever we might peak out or begin to taper off. The vast majority of that history was very slow growth, and only in the last couple hundred years, when we had agriculture be able to support a larger population, did it grow. That productivity doesn't seem to be slowing. Genetic improvements, informational improvements, the use of meaningful crop protection systems to grow more with less, to do it with less effluent, more containment of the nutrients. All of this has gone on at a rate that dwarfs almost anything else except certain other technologies. And they tend to be, and this has happened in agriculture now for a long time and will continue. We make quantum changes in things like AI, quantum changes in things like certain energy issues, but in agriculture, it's a long, steady march. And I don't see that there's a top of that particular climb. I think it's going to continue.
Okay, that's fascinating, but deep. It's deep, it's helpful, forward-looking, but let's end with something fun, okay?
Okay.
Since you just mentioned food, and literally as I'm talking to you, my stomach is growling. For those of us who follow you on Instagram, you like exploring food creation.
I'm not sure how you found that. That's largely a result of my daughter and an effort we made a couple years ago to document to each other what we were doing healthy. I do love to cook and I love the presentation of food, and this is all true. I don't know how you found that though.
Well, I do my due diligence occasionally. Give me something, a recent creation that has worked well for you that you're proud of.
Oh gosh, nothing terribly profound. I'll give you two though.
Okay.
I bought a pizza oven not too long ago, and I've discovered how many different ways you can make homemade pizza dough that completely change what you put on top. And it
Ah.
turns out that the topping doesn't need to start with something that's red from smashed up, dried out tomatoes. You can do way more complicated things, and I would prefer to cook all of my meals outside over an open source of
Oh,
flame if
amen.
I could.
Hmm.
So the other one is just the number of different ways you can air fry things now.
Hmm. We have one of those.
Again,
Love that thing.
a lesson from my daughter, who's a very healthy eater and who uh, is. I'm happy to call her out as the main driver behind all the things you must have found on Instagram. So,
She may be the reason that she just added some years to your life, though, with this healthy
oh,
eating,
indeed, indeed,
right?
we did. I encourage everybody to do this. Take a month and write down everything you eat, and then what you enjoyed about eating, and what you feel better after you ate. And at the end of the month, you might have a habit or two that's different. And it happened to me. So.
Nice. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. It's
Appreciate
always
the
a
time.
delight. I'm sorry I got a little long-winded on some of your questions, but
Not at all.
look forward to future conversations with you as well.
We got to do a cooking segment with Bruce sometime. Well, cooking is not part of our profile piece, but more of Bruce's thoughts about what's happening with farmland values are. You can check that out in our weekly newsletter at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. It's free, and if you go to the website, you can put your email address in there and get the newsletter sent right to you every week. Usually shows up sometime after lunch on Friday afternoons. Thanks for supporting what we're building here, these in-depth conversations with industry leaders, and thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.